I watched my son's hands tremble as he held the DNA test results, his face draining of color. But it wasn't shame I saw in his eyes. It was rage, pure, venomous rage directed at me. His father, my husband of 35 years, stood frozen beside him. And for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear flash across that man's face. That's when I knew the nightmare I'd been living for the past 6 months was about to reveal a truth more horrifying than any of us could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Margaret, and I'm 64 years old now. The story I'm about to tell you happened 28 years ago, but I remember every detail as if it were yesterday. Some wounds never truly heal. They just scar over. And every now and then, something tears them open again. I met Richard at a charity gala in Chicago when I was 36 years old. I'd been working as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and one of my patients had gifted me a ticket to this fancy fundraiser. I almost didn't go. I'd never been comfortable in those high society circles, but my colleague convinced me it would be good to get out. Richard was 42, a successful investment banker from one of Chicago's oldest families. The Ashworths were practically royalty in certain circles. Old money, old connections, old expectations. He was charming that night, attentive in a way that made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. We talked for hours about everything except money and status. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, in my modest upbringing in Wisconsin, in my dreams of one day running a community health clinic. I should have known it was too good to be true. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. His family was polite. That's the word I'd use. His mother, Constance, never openly disapproved, but I could see it in the way she'd examine my clothes, my manners, my background. His father, Howard, was different. He was warm, almost too warm. He'd pat my hand during family dinners, compliment me excessively, stand just a bit too close. I told myself I was being paranoid. These were Richard's parents. They were just trying to make me feel welcome. We married in the spring of 1997 at the Ashworth family estate in Lake Forest. It was a beautiful ceremony, though I barely knew half the guests. My parents had passed away years earlier, and I had only a few friends from the hospital in attendance. I felt like Cinderella, except I couldn't shake the feeling that midnight was coming. The first year was happy. We lived in Richard's penthouse in downtown Chicago, and I continued working at the hospital. Richard's job required long hours, frequent travel, but when he was home, he was attentive and loving. We started trying for a baby almost immediately. Richard wanted children, or more accurately, his parents wanted grandchildren. The Ashworth legacy needed heirs. Month after month, I wasn't getting pregnant. After a year, we saw specialists. The tests came back normal for both of us. Just stress, the doctors said. It'll happen when you relax. But the pressure from Constance was anything but relaxing. Every family dinner became an inquisition about my fertility, subtle comments about my age, suggestions for alternative treatments, acupuncture, special diets. The worst part? Richard never defended me. He'd just sit there, cutting his steak, while his mother picked apart my worth as a wife based on my empty womb. It was during one of these family dinners, 2 years into our marriage, that everything changed. We were at the Ashworth estate for Howard's 65th birthday. It was November, cold and dreary. The house was full of relatives and business associates. I remember feeling exhausted from another unsuccessful month, another round of invasive tests. Howard insisted I try a glass of his special wine collection. "This one's from France," he said, his hand on my shoulder, fingers pressing just a bit too firmly. 1982. An excellent year. "You look like you need to relax, Margaret." I didn't want to be rude. Constance was already watching me with those cold blue eyes, waiting for me to make a social misstep, so I drank the wine. It tasted strange, bitter underneath the fruit notes, but I attributed that to my unsophisticated palate. The rest of that evening is fragmented in my memory. I remember feeling dizzy, making an excuse to lie down in one of the guest rooms. I remember the room spinning, feeling like I was underwater. I remember someone coming into the room, a man's silhouette, but I thought it was Richard checking on me. I remember hands, but the details are blurry, dreamlike. I woke up the next morning in the guest room, still fully clothed but feeling wrong. Violated somehow, though I couldn't explain why. Richard was annoyed that I'd disappeared from the party. "You embarrassed me," he said coldly on the drive home. "My father went through all that trouble to make you feel included, and you got drunk and passed out." I tried to tell him I'd only had one glass, that something felt off, but he just turned up the radio. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. 3 weeks later, I missed my period. I didn't tell Richard immediately. I wanted to be sure. I bought 3 different pregnancy tests from 3 different pharmacies, all positive. I was pregnant. Finally, after 2 years of trying, of failing, of feeling inadequate, I was pregnant. The joy was indescribable. I planned an elaborate reveal for Richard, a tiny pair of baby shoes in a gift box. When he opened it, he cried, actually cried. He called his parents immediately, and I heard the relief in his voice. The relief that I'd finally fulfilled my primary purpose. Constance's tone toward me shifted overnight. Suddenly I was valuable, precious, even. Howard seemed almost euphoric, constantly asking about my health, insisting I quit my job to focus on the pregnancy, sending gift baskets and flowers. It should have felt loving, but something about his intensity made my skin crawl. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted well into the 2nd trimester. Fatigue. Anxiety. The doctor said it was normal, especially for a first-time mother in her late 30s. Richard was attentive at first, but as my body changed, he became distant. More business trips. Later nights at the office. Our son, Christopher, was born in August 1998 after 16 hours of labor. The moment they placed him in my arms, I fell completely in love. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a healthy weight. But Richard barely looked at him. He seemed distracted, almost uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, Richard's behavior grew stranger. He'd stare at Christopher with this odd expression, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He asked me multiple times if I was absolutely certain about my due date, about when I'd gotten pregnant. He started making comments about Christopher's features. "He doesn't look much like me," he'd say, examining our son's face like a detective looking for clues. "Babies change," I'd respond, confused and hurt. "Give him time." But Christopher's features became more defined, and Richard's suspicions grew more pointed. Our son had hazel eyes with flecks of green, unusual, since both Richard and I had brown eyes. His hair, what little he had, was lighter than either of ours. These were things that could be explained by recessive genes, by grandparents' features, but Richard had latched onto them like evidence of a crime. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening when Christopher was 3 months old. I was in the nursery, feeding him, when Richard burst in with his mother. Constance's face was twisted with disgust, and Richard's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice ice-cold. I put Christopher in his crib and followed them to the living room, my heart pounding. Howard was there too, sitting in the leather armchair, his face unreadable. "I want a paternity test," Richard announced without preamble. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "You heard me. I want a DNA test. I don't think Christopher is my son." I felt the room tilt. "How can you say that? How can you even think that?" "Look at him, Margaret!" Richard shouted. "He doesn't look anything like me." "The timing is suspicious. You were so desperate to get pregnant, maybe you decided to get help elsewhere." "Help elsewhere?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You think I cheated on you?" "What else am I supposed to think?" He pulled out his phone, showing me photos he'd apparently been taking of Christopher, analyzing our son's features like some kind of investigator. "I've done research. These traits don't match either of our families." Constance sat primly on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. "It's just a test, Margaret. If you have nothing to hide, you should have no problem agreeing to it." I looked at Howard, hoping for some sanity, some defense, but he was staring at his hands, his face pale and drawn. "Fine," I said, my voice shaking with rage and hurt. "Let's do the test. Let's prove what a paranoid fool you're being." The next day, we went to a private laboratory. Richard insisted on coming along, watching every step of the process like I might somehow tamper with it. They swabbed Christopher's cheek, then Richard's, then mine. We were told the results would take 5 to 7 business days. Those days were torture. Richard barely spoke to me. He slept in the guest room. Constance called daily with thinly veiled accusations. I threw myself into caring for Christopher, trying to ignore the fear creeping into my heart. Not fear that the test would prove Richard right. I knew I'd never been unfaithful. But fear about what this meant for our marriage. How do you come back from your husband accusing you of infidelity? The results came back on a Friday. Richard opened the envelope in front of his entire family. They'd gathered at the estate like it was some kind of tribunal. Me, Richard, Constance, Howard, and Richard's sister Patricia, who'd flown in from New York specifically for this. I stood there, holding Christopher, absolutely certain the test would prove Richard wrong and this nightmare would end. Richard's face went white as he read the results. Then red, then white again. "You lying whore," he said, his voice deadly quiet. I felt my legs go weak. What? The probability of paternity. 0%. He read from the paper, his voice rising. 0%. That child is not mine. The room erupted. Constance was screaming at me. Patricia was crying. Howard sat frozen in his chair. And Richard looked at me with such hatred that I actually stepped backward. "How could you?" he shouted. "How could you humiliate me like this? Humiliate my family?" "There must be a mistake," I stammered, my mind reeling. "That's impossible. I would never—" "Don't lie to me." Richard grabbed the paper, waving it in my face. "It's right here in black and white. You cheated on me and tried to pass off your bastard as my son." "No!" I was crying now, Christopher wailing in my arms from the shouting. "Richard, please, there has to be an explanation. The explanation is that you're a whore who trapped me into marriage so you could live off my family's money." He turned to his parents. "I want a divorce. Immediately. And I want her out of my house tonight." That's when Howard stood up. His face was gray, and his hands were shaking worse than mine. "Stop," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. We need another test," Howard said, his voice barely audible. "What?" Constance snapped. "Why? The results are clear. We need to test." "We need to test me," Howard said, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as understanding slowly dawned on Richard's face, then horror. "What are you saying, Dad?" Richard whispered. Howard wouldn't look at anyone. His hands were trembling violently now. "That night, my birthday, the wine, Margaret, you don't remember, do you?" The room started spinning. Fragments of that night flashed through my mind. The bitter wine, the dizzy feeling, waking up feeling wrong. "What did you do?" I heard myself ask, though my voice sounded far away. "I'm so sorry," Howard whispered. "You were so beautiful. And Constance and we haven't, in years. And Richard wasn't giving us a grandchild. I thought if you got pregnant, it would solve everything. No one would know. I thought he'd look like Richard, that no one would ever know." Richard lunged at his father. It took both Patricia and me to pull him off. Constance sat frozen, her perfect composure finally shattered, tears streaming down her face. "You raped her," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You drugged and raped my wife. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Howard sobbed. "I just wanted a grandchild for the family." The next hours were a blur. Someone called the police. Howard was arrested. I had to give a statement, explaining about the wine, the missing time, the violation I'd felt but couldn't explain. A rape kit was impossible at this point. It had been nearly a year, but there was Christopher. The DNA evidence. The second test confirmed it. Christopher was Howard's biological son. My husband's father had drugged and raped me, impregnating me with my own grandson's stepson. The genetic nightmare of it, the legal nightmare, the emotional nightmare. It was almost too much to comprehend. Richard and I separated immediately, but not out of anger at each other anymore. How could our marriage survive this? Every time he looked at Christopher, he'd see his father's crime. Every time I looked at Christopher, I'd be reminded of the assault I couldn't even fully remember. But here's what nobody expected. As the shock wore off and reality set in, Richard and I started talking. Really talking, for the first time in our marriage. We went to therapy, separately and together. We worked through the trauma, the betrayal, the complicated web of victimhood and innocence. And Christopher. Sweet, innocent Christopher, who had no fault in any of this, who deserved parents who loved him despite the horrific circumstances of his conception. Richard stepped up in a way I never expected. "He's my brother," Richard said one day during a therapy session. "Biologically. But he's also the child you carried and birthed. And he's innocent. None of this is his fault." We decided to try to make it work. Not for appearances, not for the Ashworth family legacy. Howard's trial had destroyed that anyway. But for Christopher, for ourselves, for the possibility that something good could come from something so terrible. It wasn't easy. Richard had to mourn the loss of fatherhood in the traditional sense while embracing a new role. I had to process being a rape victim while also being a mother to my rapist child. We moved away from Chicago, away from the memories and the scandal. We started over in Portland, where nobody knew our story. Howard was convicted of sexual assault and served 8 years in prison. Constance divorced him immediately and moved to Arizona. We never spoke to her again. The Ashworth fortune was tied up in legal battles and settlements. Richard took his portion and walked away from the rest. Christopher is 26 now. He knows his story. We told him when he turned 18 because we never wanted him to find out accidentally. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but he handled it with grace and maturity. He's in medical school now, wants to be a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. He says his story gave him purpose. Richard and I stayed married. We had 2 more children. Adopted. Both of them, beautiful souls we chose rather than conceived. Our family doesn't look like anyone else's, and our story certainly isn't one you'd see in a fairy tale, but it's ours. Built on truth, honesty, and the decision to find light even in the darkest circumstances. I'm 64 now, and when I look back on that day, standing in the Ashworth family living room, being accused of infidelity while holding the baby conceived in rape, I remember the crushing weight of injustice. I remember thinking my life was over. But sometimes the most twisted stories have unexpected endings. Sometimes the test results that destroy everything also set you free. Because that DNA test didn't just reveal a crime, it revealed the truth. And truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than living a lie. Howard died in prison 3 years into his sentence. I felt nothing when I got the news. Not satisfaction, not grief, just nothing. He'd stolen something from me I could never get back. My agency, my memory of that night, my simple joy in Christopher's birth. But he couldn't steal my future. That was mine to claim. So if you're out there, going through something impossible, facing a truth so ugly you want to run from it, don't. Face it. Get the test. Demand the truth. Because you deserve to know. You deserve to make decisions based on reality, not comfortable lies. And to anyone who's ever been falsely accused, who's ever stood their ground while the world called them a liar, I see you. I believe you. The truth has a way of coming out, even when it takes forms we never could have imagined. My name is Margaret, and this is my story. The story of the DNA test that destroyed my marriage, and then, somehow, saved it. The story of finding justice in the most unexpected way. The story of learning that family isn't always about biology. It's about choice, commitment, and love that endures even the most twisted circumstances. Christopher calls me every Sunday. Richard and I just celebrated our 28th anniversary. Our adopted children are thriving. We built a life